There's a building in the city of London, a square mile of earth that operates under its own laws, its own police force, its own government, where one family's financial decisions have, at various points in history, determined whether nations went to war, whether monarchs kept their thrones, and whether entire economies lived or died. In 1815, a courier rode hard through the night from Waterloo. He carried news that would move markets, and the family that received it first, before kings, before generals, before anyone else, used it to execute one of the most profitable trades in the history of modern finance. Most people think the global banking system is controlled by central banks and elected governments. They're looking at the surface. Beneath the visible architecture of international finance lies a dynasty so old, so deeply embedded, and so deliberately understated that most people can't tell you their full story, even though their influence touches every dollar, every euro, and every sovereign bond in the modern world. This is the story of the Rothschild family, and what you're about to learn will change the way you see money. Today, we're taking a look at a dynasty that has survived Napoleon, 2 world wars, the collapse of the British Empire, and the digital revolution, and come out of every single one of those catastrophes, not just intact, but more powerful. We're going to uncover how a family that started in a cramped Frankfurt ghetto built a 5-city banking network that financed the British Crown, funded the Suez Canal, and quietly shaped the outcome of the American Civil War. And wait until you hear about the secret meeting that set the world's gold price. A meeting that happened in a private room in London for over 80 years before most of the public even knew it existed. By the end of this, you'll understand why the Rothschild name is simultaneously the most powerful and most deliberately invisible brand in the history of global finance, and why that invisibility is not an accident. It's a strategy. The year is 1744. Frankfurt, Germany. A cramped, walled street called the Judengasse, the Jews' Alley. A ghetto by law, sealed with a gate at night. Jewish families here were forbidden from owning land, barred from most trades, taxed simply for stepping into public spaces. This is where Meyer Amschel Bauer was born. The world he entered had rigid walls, legal, social, physical. But from inside those walls, he watched something the aristocracy around him largely ignored: the movement of money. Old coins, rare currency, the obscure art of numismatics, which, in 18th century Europe, happened to place you in direct contact with the one class of people who needed discreet financial services more than anyone else: the nobility. Meyer had a gift, not just for finance, but for relationships. He cultivated a connection with Prince Wilhelm IX of Hesse-Kassel, one of the wealthiest men in Europe. Wilhelm had made a fortune hiring out his own soldiers as mercenaries. He needed someone he could trust to manage, move, and multiply that money quietly. Meyer, who by now had changed his family name from Bauer to Rothschild after the red shield that hung above his family's door, became that man. In 1769, he earned the designation of court factor to Prince Wilhelm. It was a title. But more than that, it was a door. By 1800, Meyer had built a modest but formidable operation. He had fathered 10 children, 5 sons and 5 daughters, and before he died in 1812, he executed what would become one of the greatest strategic deployments of human capital in financial history. He sent each of his 5 sons to a different European capital. Amschel stayed in Frankfurt. Salomon went to Vienna. Nathan, the most brilliant of them all, went to London. Kalman went to Naples. Jakob, who would rename himself James, went to Paris. 5 cities, 5 banks, 1 family, 1 set of encrypted letters flowing between them at speeds no government intelligence service could match. The Rothschild network wasn't just a banking family. It was the first multinational financial institution in the history of the world, and it was run by blood. Of the 5 brothers, it was Nathan in London who would transform the family from wealthy financiers into something the world had never seen before. Nathan wasn't charming in the conventional sense. He was blunt, relentless, and possessed of a financial instinct that bordered on supernatural. When he arrived in England in 1798, he didn't start in banking. He started in textiles in Manchester. Within a decade, he had multiplied his capital so aggressively that he relocated to London and established N.M. Rothschild, and Sons on St. Swithin's Lane in the City of London. Then came Waterloo, June 1815. The fate of Europe hangs on a single battle. Nathan had positioned bets on both sides, but more importantly, he had built something no government possessed, a private courier network faster than any military dispatch system in Europe. When Napoleon fell on June 18th, a Rothschild courier was among the first to carry the news across the channel. Nathan received confirmation of British victory a full day before the British government got its official dispatch. What he did next is still debated. According to the most widely circulated account, he appeared at the London Stock Exchange and began to sell, visibly, aggressively. The market, reading his movements as a signal that Britain had lost, followed him into panic. Prices collapsed. Then Nathan bought everything at the bottom. By the time official news of British victory reached the exchange, the Rothschild fortune had compounded to a degree that made them not merely wealthy, but systemically important. The British government itself became dependent on Rothschild financing. In 1818, the family issued a £5 million loan to the Prussian government, one of the first sovereign bond issuances of the modern era. It was oversubscribed. Governments across Europe took notice. If you needed to finance a war, rebuild after one, or stabilize a currency, there was one address in London you needed to visit. By 1825, Nathan personally rescued the Bank of England during a liquidity crisis, injecting gold reserves at the exact moment the central bank of the most powerful empire on earth was on the verge of failure. Let that land. A private Jewish banker from a family that one generation earlier had been legally confined to a ghetto saved the Bank of England. The momentum never stopped. They financed Britain's Napoleonic War debt. They funded the Emancipation Loan when Brazil abolished slavery. In 1875, Lionel de Rothschild arranged a £4 million loan to the British government overnight, enabling Prime Minister Disraeli to purchase a controlling stake in the Suez Canal before France could consolidate its grip on the waterway. £4 million. One conversation, no committee, no parliament. The canal that controlled global trade between Europe and Asia, secured at a dinner table. Each decade brought a new crisis, and each crisis became a corridor the dynasty walked through and emerged from richer, more connected, more indispensable than before. This wasn't luck. This was architecture, the deliberate, generational construction of an empire designed, above all else, to be irreplaceable. Here's what most people get wrong about the Rothschilds in the 21st century. They assume the dynasty faded, that the great banking empires of the 19th century got swallowed by the Goldmans, the J.P. Morgans, the Citigroups. They look at the Forbes billionaire list, see no Rothschild at the top, and conclude the story is over. That's exactly what the family wants you to think. The Rothschild empire today isn't structured like a corporation you can track on a stock exchange. It's structured more like a sovereign entity, a web of private partnerships, holding companies, family trusts, and advisory firms that operate largely outside the scrutiny of public markets. At the center of that web sits Rothschild & Co., the advisory and asset management firm headquartered in Paris, with major operations in London, New York, Frankfurt, and Zurich. It advises on mergers, acquisitions, and restructurings, representing hundreds of billions in transactions every year. In 2023, the family took it fully private, delisting from the Paris Stock Exchange in a deal valued at approximately 3.7 billion euros. The message was clear. We're moving further from public view, not closer. But Rothschild & Co. is just the visible tip. Concordia BV, the private holding company controlled by the family, holds the majority of assets that never appear in mainstream financial reporting. Through a constellation of trusts spread across Switzerland, Luxembourg, and the United Kingdom, the family manages an estimated $700 billion to $1 trillion in assets under influence. Their own wealth, plus the sovereign funds, institutional portfolios, and private fortunes they manage on behalf of others. To put that in perspective, $700 billion is larger than the entire GDP of Switzerland, more than the combined market cap of Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and Deutsche Bank. And that's the conservative estimate. Beyond finance, their holdings span an extraordinary range. Significant stakes in Société Générale, mining operations across Africa and South America, wine estates, including Chateau Mouton Rothschild and Chateau Lafite Rothschild, that represent two of the most valuable agricultural properties on Earth, with single bottles of Lafitte fetching upward of $230,000 at auction. Their real estate spans continents: historic English estates, Central Paris commercial holdings, private Swiss compounds, American ranches. Waddesdon Manor in Buckinghamshire, a French Renaissance chateau built in the 1870s, sits on 6,000 acres and houses one of the most significant private art collections in the United Kingdom. Every time a major European government issues sovereign debt, there's a meaningful chance a Rothschild-affiliated institution is in the room. Every time a Fortune 500 company executes a multi-billion-dollar merger, there's a good chance Rothschild & Co. helped structure the deal. You don't see the name on the building, rarely in the press release, but the fingerprints are everywhere. To understand how the Rothschilds actually live, you need to throw out every assumption you have about what extreme wealth looks like. This isn't the world of Instagram yachts and Las Vegas penthouses. This is older than that, quieter, and infinitely more expensive. Waddesdon Manor is the one the public gets to see, and even that is staggering. A French Renaissance chateau on 6,000 acres of English countryside, built in the 1870s at a cost that in today's money would exceed $500 million. The construction was so ambitious they had to import Clydesdales specially trained to haul materials up the hill because no existing vehicle could manage the gradient. And Waddesdon is the showpiece. Chateau Lafitte in Bordeaux's Pauillac region sits on 112 acres of the most valuable agricultural land in the world. The estate features a circular underground wine cellar designed by architect Ricardo Bofill, a cathedral of wine holding millions of bottles, some dating back over a century. The property as a combined estate and brand is estimated to be worth in excess of $1 billion. Then there's Exbury House in Hampshire, a 225-acre estate with one of the most spectacular private gardens in the world. Lionel de Rothschild reportedly spent the equivalent of $20 million in today's money on the garden alone. At its peak, he employed over 150 full-time gardeners. 150 gardeners for one garden. The art collections across Rothschild properties represent one of the greatest private accumulations ever assembled. Vermeer, Gainsborough, Reynolds, Rubens, hanging in rooms most of the world will never enter. Conservatively appraised at over $1 billion. Almost certainly more. Travel doesn't involve conventional airports. Private aviation, dedicated crews, departure from private terminals where your name doesn't appear on any publicly accessible manifest. Their social world is equally invisible. This is a family that has dined with British monarchs and advised French presidents, not as celebrities seeking access, but as peers, as equals. In some rooms, as the most important person present. The schools their children attend, Eton, Sciences Po, Oxford, the London School of Economics, aren't chosen for prestige alone. They're chosen because the corridors of those institutions are where the next generation of central bankers, political leaders, and corporate titans are formed. The Rothschilds have understood for 2 centuries that the most valuable investment you can make isn't in a company, it's in a relationship. In 1910, a group of the most powerful bankers in America boarded a private train in New Jersey. They traveled under fake names, no identifying luggage. Their destination, Jekyll Island, a private retreat off the Georgia coast. The meeting they held there, in total secrecy, would produce the blueprint for the Federal Reserve System. Among the architects were institutions with direct Rothschild affiliations. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented history. The Rothschild family has never needed public office to shape public policy. They discovered something more durable than a seat in parliament. The people who finance governments hold more lasting power than the governments themselves. Politicians come and go every 4 years. Dynasties endure for centuries. Now, the London Gold Fix. From 1919 until 2004, 85 consecutive years, the daily price of gold for the entire global market was set in a private meeting room at the offices of N.M. Rothschild and Sons on St. Swithin's Lane in London. 5 banks, a phone call, twice a day, the price of the most universally recognized store of value on Earth, decided in a room the public had no access to, no visibility into, and no vote over. 85 years. In 2004, the Rothschild Bank quietly withdrew from the gold fixing process, just before increased regulatory scrutiny began transforming how commodity prices were set. The timing, as with so many Rothschild moves, was impeccable. Their political connections in the modern era are equally formidable. Lord Jacob Rothschild, who passed away in February 2024 at the age of 87, counted among his personal relationships Henry Kissinger, Margaret Thatcher, Rupert Murdoch, and Bill Clinton. His estate at Waddesdon hosted private gatherings that functioned, by most accounts, as informal policy salons for the Anglo-American establishment. In France, the family's influence runs just as deep. Baron David de Rothschild maintained relationships with every major French political figure, from Mitterrand to Macron, and Emmanuel Macron, it's worth noting, worked as an investment banker at Rothschild & Co. from 2008 to 2012 before entering politics. His most celebrated deal during that tenure, advising on the €9 billion merger of Pfizer's nutrition division with Nestlé, earned him the nickname in French financial circles of the Mozart of finance. The man who currently runs France spent 4 years working for the Rothschilds. Then there's Israel. The Rothschild family's role in the founding of the modern state is not peripheral. It is foundational. Baron Edmund de Rothschild began financing Jewish agricultural settlements in Ottoman Palestine as early as 1882, spending an estimated $50 million of his personal fortune, over $1 billion in today's money, on land purchases and settlement infrastructure. He is referred to in Israeli historical literature by a Hebrew word that translates to the benefactor. The Knesset menorah in Jerusalem bears a Rothschild dedication, a private family, a personal fortune, a country. And yet, despite all of this, the Rothschild name rarely appears in mainstream financial journalism, rarely trends, rarely surfaces in the breathless coverage that follows every Elon Musk tweet or Jeff Bezos decision. That silence isn't absence, it's mastery. The most powerful entities in the world don't seek the spotlight. They position themselves so that the spotlight can't function without them. In February 2024, Lord Jacob Rothschild died at 87. The obituaries were respectful, measured, and almost uniformly understated, which is perhaps the most Rothschild thing imaginable. The Financial Times called him a financier and philanthropist. Almost no mainstream outlet attempted to fully reckon with what his passing actually represented: the end of a direct link to the 19th century architecture of global finance and the beginning of a new chapter in a dynasty that has now survived for over 250 years. The transition had already been carefully managed long before his death. This is what separates generational dynasties from generational wealth. Ordinary wealthy families accumulate money. Extraordinary dynasties build systems, legal structures, institutional relationships, governance frameworks designed to outlast any single individual and transfer power with minimal friction. The current steward of the empire is Alexandra de Rothschild, who took the helm of Rothschild & Co. in 2018 at the age of 37. He represents the 7th generation of direct family leadership over the firm, a continuity of control with no parallel in the history of modern finance. Under his leadership, the firm has expanded aggressively into wealth management, private equity, and sustainable investment, positioning itself for the next half-century rather than the last one. Alexandra is deliberate, media-shy, and fluent in the language of institutional relationships. He is, in other words, exactly what you'd expect from a family that has spent 2 centuries perfecting the art of durable power. Beyond Rothschild & Company, the next generation is spread across venture capital, sustainable agriculture, technology investment, and the arts. No single point of failure, no single dependency. A network, not a hierarchy. The wine tells its own story. Chateau Lafite and Chateau Mouton are cultural monuments at this point. Decades ago, the family identified China as the future of ultra-premium consumption and spent years building the Lafite brand in Shanghai and Beijing, long before most Western luxury brands even had a strategy there. Today, Lafite is the single most coveted wine label among China's ultra-wealthy, a market penetration so complete it has reshaped global wine pricing. They saw it coming. They positioned, they won. This is the pattern across 250 years and 7 generations. Every era brings new threats: Napoleon, world wars, nationalization, regulation, digital disruption. And in every era, the family has done the same thing: retreated slightly from public view, restructured quietly, positioned for the next century. and emerged more deeply embedded in the architecture of power than before. So here's the question this dynasty ultimately forces us to ask. In a world that celebrates the self-made billionaire, the garage startup, the disruptive founder, the first-generation titan, what does it mean that the most durable financial empire in modern history was built not in a generation, but across 10 of them? Not through disruption, but through continuity? Not through visibility, but through the patient, deliberate cultivation of invisibility? The Rothschilds didn't build a company. They built a bloodline with a balance sheet. And 2.5 centuries later, while the names of most of their contemporaries have faded into footnotes, the dynasty endures. Not despite the changing world, but because of its extraordinary ability to change with it, ahead of it, and when necessary, ahead of everyone else. The red shield still hangs above the door. It always has.